Tell me your story. We've been doing that over the past few weeks, looking at various events that took place early in the Bible. Today we're looking at kingdom. If I was king for just one day. That line from a song in the 1980s captures kind of what's going on the inside for us. It speaks for what's in our hearts. It's what we long for. All of us have had that thought at one time or another. If I was just king for one day. We want to be king. We all want to be king. Now, it doesn't always look like a monarchy. In fact, as Americans, we have a hard time identifying with just what a monarchy looks like, which is kind of interesting when we come to the text then and we start reading about kings. We don't have one. But we all want it to be a king. From the moment we are born, we have an inner king me. King me on the inside. Everything I do is aimed at making me king. This king me is always demanding control in both of our lives and the world around us. And we live in a society that tells us that's okay. We not only try to control what's going on with us, we have this habit, King Me has this habit of wanting to control what you're doing. Not just what I'm doing. And King Me is cultivated by our society. King Me is cultivated to be all that he can be. Be all you can be. King Me is told, just do it. Constantly reinforced. We're trained to win everything. We're trained to win the job. We're trained to win the conversation. We're trained to win the girl or the guy. We're trained to win the moment. We're told, don't let anybody ever take advantage of you. And then we spend our lives making sure that never, ever happens. That is King Me. Always wanting to be in control. If I was king for just one day. So our story today is about kingdom. And kingdom and kings are a running theme throughout the scriptures. Now we've been looking at our story now for a few weeks. We looked at our story in the garden in the fall. And then we looked at the story of Noah and the flood. So our story's there as God saves a family in the midst of the flood. We also looked at Abraham and the covenant. God's promises given to one. That he's going to give him a son and make of him a great nation. And then we see how that nation develops and evolves in Egypt. And we see our story as God rescues his people from Egypt. Israel leaves Egypt. And that's where we left off last week. They cross through the Red Sea. Eventually they do. They make their way into the Promised Land. And they begin the conquest of what we now know as Israel, that piece of real estate on the east side of the Mediterranean. God gives that land to his people, and they conquer most of the bad people. And part of our story is not all of them were conquered. They conquer most of the bad people, and they begin to settle in their land. And as they do, there becomes this rhythm with Israel where there are times where they are following God and doing what he expects and worshiping him like he expects them to. And then there are other times they don't give a rip. And so you've got this cycle of times where everything's good, everything's bad, everything's good, everything's bad, everything good, everything bad. And this whole time they have no king. Which also becomes an interesting part of the story. They have no king. And you see, there was this expectation of a king. You see, we started the story in the garden, and we moved through the flood, and we moved through Abraham, and then we moved through Moses, and all along the way, there also begins to be this running narrative or this running storyline through all of these different stories and these events of a coming king. Remember that promise to Adam in the garden, God says He's going to fix the sin problem. He is going to send a Savior. It's very vague, but as we come out of the garden and we start to move through Genesis into Exodus and we start to follow what's going on, an emerging portrait begins to show up as to what this Savior is going to look like. And one of the first things that shows up is this idea that whoever this person is going to be a king. Someday there'll be a son who rights all the wrongs. And so various points throughout these stories and the text in Israel's history, we have various people saying, hey, there's coming a king someday. And what's interesting is they're even praying for kings and talking about kings, and they have no king. So there is this expectation. God finally gives Israel a king. And the problem is this guy he's not all that great. He's not a great king. In fact, he's not the answer. He's not acting much like a king at all. And this goes on for some time, and in the middle of his rule, God finally again says, enough. We're done. Or we're going to be done. And so in the middle of his rule, there is another young boy just south of what we now know as Jerusalem, who is a shepherd. And in the story of Samuel, this shepherd boy is anointed as the next king. While that king is still sitting on the throne and still leading his people into battle, doing all the things that kings do. But David is this young shepherd boy, actually a teenager, and he becomes the king in waiting. Samuel has anointed this young man, and he is going to wait his turn, but it will be coming. David will be the next king. God is going to turn His people over to David at some point. And that's where we come to our text this morning. David is anointed. David begins to actually serve in King Saul's court, playing music. He plays music to keep Saul happy. But 1 Samuel 17, our passage this morning, opens with Israel at war. In fact, they're not really the ones that started it. It looks like the Philistines, who are a perennial bad guy for Israel. The Philistines are the one that started it. They show up and they're ready for war. The Philistines are at Israel's doorstep. It's very easy because this is a story that is familiar to us, and we tend to know how this all ends, and we sometimes even know some of the details of what's going on. It's very easy for us to think, oh, hey, this is simply a couple of kids that can't get along. But if we pay attention to things that are actually being said and stated throughout this particular event and this story, the Philistines aren't here as part of some playground joust. They're ready to take Israel. In fact, things are so bad, God's promises to Israel are on the line here. If the Philistines win, Israel loses it all. They lose their people, they lose their land. And God's promises become null and void, no longer good. There's much more at stake here than simply a couple of guys who are full of testosterone going to settle a score. No, this is real life stuff. Life and death stuff, where it's all on the line. The big bad Philistines are famous for their giants. And Israel has a history with giants. And when they first went to the Promised Land, Israel didn't even want to go in because there were giants in the land. They said, we don't want to fight those guys. The Philistines are known as the land of giants. And their champion at this time is a guy named Goliath. Goliath is 9'9". That means if he stands under a basketball net, his hair is part of the net. 9'9". His armor, we're told this in the text, weighs 125 pounds. Think about that. Head to toe, full of armor. Now, the writer of Samuel wants us to see how big and bad this is. In fact, the text tells us that this guy is experienced. He's not a rookie. He's as big and bad as promised. And Goliath has no use for Israel or her God. He challenges Israel. And this is what Goliath says. Choose one of your men. Have him come down against me. If he wins in a fight against me and kills me, we will be your servants. But if I win against him and kill him, then you will be our servants and serve us. And this is the way they fought in those days. Instead of everybody going out into the middle of the field, they would send their champion, the best, to fight it out. And that would determine the destiny of the two nations. That's the challenge. Instead of an all-out battle, send your best to fight with me. And if we win, we get you and we get your land. And Goliath does this, the text says, he does this for 40 days, every morning and every evening, walking out into the middle of the valley and issuing this challenge. For 40 days, he's doing this. Well, with this ungodly giant mocking Israel, what's Israel going to do? They're going to go out and face him? Where's their challenge? Where's Israel's king? Is he answering the bell? No. 1 Samuel 17:11. And Saul and all Israel heard these words from the Philistine. They lost their courage and were terrified. When all the Israelite men saw Goliath, they retreated from him, terrified. Saul and Israel. The one who represents God's rule, the one who had been placed on the throne. God still ruled his people, but he was doing it with his representative, the king. And so the spokesperson for the people on behalf of God is nowhere to be found. And Saul is supposed to be leading his men against Goliath, and it's so bad. Again, the way Saul is being portrayed here is he's not much of a leader. In fact, he even offers his daughter in marriage to the guy that will go and do this. He's supposed to be the one doing this. Instead, he's offering some sweepstakes. If you do this, you'll live tax-free the rest of your life, and you get my daughter in marriage. You become part of the royal household. For the guy who takes care of that problem. You see, Saul thinks he has to fight Goliath on Goliath's terms. He betrays this in the way he talks. Muscle takes muscle. You fight muscle with muscle. You fight strategy with strategy. You use Goliath's means to beat him. If Goliath is setting the playing field, well, by all means, then we are going to use and operate using that same playing field. Playing Goliath's game. And so thinking like Goliath and using Goliath's own way of thinking, he looks at the odds, and the odds don't look very good to him. So he retreats. He waits it out. It's interesting. Doesn't say, it'd be interesting to see what would have happened if David hadn't shown up. Was Saul just going to wait this guy out? Wait till they all go home? That's not going to happen. He's willing to put everything at risk. He retreats and he stalls. Then there's this shepherd kid. He's probably about 18, 19. He had to be 20 to be in the army, so he probably wasn't 20 years old. But David shows up. And David hears this. Remember, Goliath's going out to the middle of the field every 40 days, morning and evening. David hears the giant breathing the threats. He finds out what it's about, and he offers to take up the challenge. And the result of David taking up the offer is, number one, scorn. His brothers scorn him. So he's dealing with the attempt by the people who think they have to beat Goliath at their own game. He is scorned and he is mocked, and he is the one who is embarrassed. And Saul believes the best way to handle Goliath, again, is Goliath's own game, so he puts his armor on David. Well, you need this. You're going to need... You don't have 120 pounds. And he puts his own armor on David, and David's like, nah, this isn't working. See, Saul thinks this is a power game. Saul sees it as a military struggle. What's interesting is we're going to look at what David actually says. Saul's looking at this as a military thing, and David is looking at it as something completely different. He's got a different pair of glasses on. David sees the threats for what they are. He sees God's promises at stake. This is the same song and dance that Pharaoh gave Moses when Moses showed up and said, "Let my people go in Egypt," about 400 years earlier. David's seen this before. Israel has seen this before, if they dare to remember. Pharaoh made all the same claims. He had the same kind of mockery. He was bent on destroying Israel, just like Goliath. So David's seen this before. David understands that the gospel is on the line. Whose narrative is going to win the day? The narrative that we don't need God, or the narrative that God is the only thing that matters? Here. See, Goliath is all about self-sufficiency. He is all about courage. He is all about strength. By the measure of Wall Street, by the measure of the Pentagon, he's a success. He's everything you'd want. David ignores it all. He ignores the scorn. He ignores the power play. He ditches the armor. He gets his slingshot. He takes 5 smooth stones from a brook. And he walks to the middle of the valley to meet Goliath. And again, Goliath, as he does, he's talking, he's taunting, he's mocking, cursing the God of Israel. And this really is the climax of the story, what David says next. It is the climax of the story. It's not David and his deadly slingshot. It's not what David is about to do. The climax of the story is what David says, because David immediately reframes the whole enterprise. He immediately reframes the entire episode. This isn't about military. This isn't about who's bigger, who's better, who's stronger, who's faster. The entire story of David and Goliath finds its meaning in what David says. In fact, this is David's speech. It's one of the longest speeches of its kind in the Old Testament. And there's a reason for it. Because this is what we're supposed to focus on in the story. This is what David says. "You come against me with a sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of armies, the God of the ranks of Israel. You've defied him. Today, the Lord will hand you over to me. Today I'll strike you down, remove your head, give the corpses of the Philistine camp to the birds of the sky and the wild creatures of the earth." Here, creation in this. So creation story is coming into play here. "Then all the world will know that Israel has a God, and this whole assembly will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's. He will hand you over to us." These are the last words that Goliath ever hears. I mean, this we saw what happened in the text. This sets him off, and the next thing you know, he's charging David. But these are the words from a king in waiting who's been anointed to be the one to lead God's people. In the face of scorn, in the face of a king who refuses to act like a king and be the king in waiting shows up. And he reframes the whole thing. He sets the narrative for what is happening. This is not about military. This is about the God of Israel. This is about the God who saves. This is about the God who makes promises. This is about the God who loves His people. And he sets about to defeat the one who would dare cast another narrative over against the God who saves and the God who loves. And embedded in this statement is mission. Mission. This is why God's promises will not fail in our day, just like they didn't fail in David's day or the day after. The end result of this war that will be over soon, the end result is that all the world will know about this God who saves and this God who loves His people. And then this whole assembly, all of the people gathered here, all of Israel will know that this God who saves, this God who loves, is not about military might. He's not about winning the day using the world's games. No, this is about His name and His fame and His glory. Israel God is not a God who needs military might. No, this is a God who used nothing but His word. David is speaking a word here, and it's this word that is going to fuel everything that happens after this. And this word is, all Israel will know that He is the one true God, and He is the one God who saves, and the one God who delivers, the one God who loves His people. This is His battle. This is His doing. Not me. This is God. Do you see a running theme here throughout these events? That this is not going to be because of David's doing at all. When the chips are down, when things look absolutely impossible because they are absolutely impossible, only God can do this. Only God can save. Only God is going to be the one to get them out of this predicament. Only God is going to be the one saving Israel from a circumstance in which His own promises are on the line. He is going to make good on His own promises. And through the king in waiting, He is going to accomplish His purposes. So David finishes this speech, and the rest is history. Goliath charges, and David throws an absolute miracle shot. It is a miracle. I mean, you read these words, and you take these words at face value. That sling and that stone, that's not David. Oh, God's using David. We tend to read these stories like, wow, David had a lot of practice. He did. He had a lot of practice. But what we're supposed to see in this text is that miracle shot. This is God's doing. Only took one shot. God saves the day. Goliath is defeated, and the Philistines are on the run. And as a result of that, God's name and God's fame are not only preserved, but it spreads. It continues. It goes to the whole world, all the way to Los Fresnos, Texas. God's name is known. His kingdom is established and preserved in Los Fresnos, Texas, as a result of what he does through a sling and a stone here. Few stories in the Bible. Again, this is probably the most popular because of our culture. We're all rooting for the underdog. I haven't looked at the Vegas line. Who's the underdog today? Is it Kansas City? Is it San Francisco? San Francisco. Everybody roots for the underdog. And that's why this is a popular story, because we like those underdog stories. When you look at all the Disney movies, there's always this one person that's going to be the underdog. You look at the B movie. B movie, typical. You got one B, doesn't want to be like everybody else. He's the underdog. And he's going to take on the world. He saves the world. One guy, one B. We like this story of the underdog. So we take this and we project our rooting for the underdog onto this story as if this is the story for the underdogs. But when we do this, we rip this story completely out of its context, because it was not meant to give us an underdog story. It's not a morality story. This isn't about how much faith we can have to face our giants. This isn't about courage. And you're going to read that. You just type in David and Goliath in the Bible out there, and immediately, I saw it this week, 5 smooth stones of success. No. That's not what this is about. It's not about bravery. It's not about being resourceful. And it's not really even about faith, though faith is involved here. We know from what David says versus what Saul is saying that David is speaking from a context of faith. But that's still not the whole story. That's not the real story here. You see, the point of the story, it's not about me or you, and that's where we get into problems. When we start reading stories like this, we immediately think, oh, hey, this is about me, so I'm supposed to see myself in David here. No, this is far bigger than it. In fact, it's far worse. This story is far worse than that. And again, it's not that we can't come to this story, because we do have fears, and fears are part of the story. It's not we don't have fears. It's not we don't need courage. But what is it that is going to drive out the fear? What is it that's going to drive the courage? It is not seeing ourselves as David in the story. In fact, there's only one person who can make that claim, to see themselves as David in the story. And who do you think that is? There's only one champion. There's only one guy who can take on the ultimate enemy of our salvation, that can take on all those fears. There's only one person that can do this. There's only one person that can leave the tent and go into the valley and to meet our enemy. There's only one. And it's not us. The opening words of the New Testament, Matthew 1:1. The New Testament begins with these words. This is an account of Jesus, the Son of David. Opening words. The whole story of Jesus opens. This is the David we have always longed for. We've always wanted. This is the King who has finally shown up. This is our champion. This is an account of Jesus, Son of David. You see, David in the story is a shepherd king, a king in waiting. And he's fighting for a kingdom that cannot be seen. And that shows up in the person of Jesus. So if you're looking for yourself in this story, who do you think we are in this story? Remember how I said it gets bad? We're Saul. We're the brothers. We're the ones in need of salvation. We're the ones who are cowering in fear. We're the ones thinking that we can get this done and we can do this using our own strength and using our own might. We're not David. We're unbelieving Saul. We're the unbelieving brothers, unbelieving Israel, in need of saving. We have to have someone go out and fight that champion for us because we can't. And we don't. And we won't. We won't. We need a champion. While we were still sinners, Romans 5, while we were still sinners, we had a champion leave the tent and go fight the fight we could not fight for ourselves. While we were figuring out how to resort to our own brute strength, while we were trying to figure out how to win the next conversation, we had somebody going out there to meet the giant. And you know what the difference is between David and the David that came? This David goes out to fight the giant, to fight the enemy of our souls, to fight for our salvation. And you know what he does? He lays down his sling. He loses. He goes to the cross. And he dies. The very thing that we fear. We fear death. We fear sin. We fear being taken advantage of. We fear people winning over us. He goes and he has it all done to himself for us. For us. That's our champion. That's our David. The kingdom is won through death and dying. And he dies at the hands of Goliath. And 3 days later, 3 days later, he cuts off the head. 3 days later, he crushes the head of the serpent, just like he promised in Genesis 3:15. But all that comes through death. All that comes through weakness. All that comes through being upside down on behalf of a people who couldn't, don't, and won't. The kingdom is won through death and dying, being forgiven and finding life in the one, the only one, who could be our David.